Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, with everyone diving back into Monster Hunter World recently, and a lot of the people who started fresh playthroughs starting to get back to the Iceborne stage of the game, I thought it would be a fun time to go back and do a tier list that I've never actually done before for the game, and to do it with the full knowledge of everything that was ever released for it in the end, and with the time between it to not attribute difficulty where I experienced personal frustration. But of course, while I'll do my best to present their ranking in a relatively unbiased manner, my own experiences will always end up being the cause of my opinions here. As well, I'll be counting just the monsters in Iceborne, not only the new ones of course, but essentially every monster that has a master rank version of it. So no base Nergigante, but Runer is here, as that way we can fairly rate their master rank versions against each other. And I'm not counting everything as being in an endgame set or anything either. We are talking about gear appropriate matchups, so it's more about the movesets and mechanics of the monsters than anything else. That said, let's start off in the F tier today, which for the sake of this list are things that I just don't see carding me more than once in a blue moon in appropriate gear. And starting this off is of course Great Jagras. He simply has no difficult mechanics of any kind. He is easy to actually hit the weak spots of. He has a lot of openings, he's just not complex. Then we have Kuliyaku, who digs up rocks out of the ground, including explosive ones in master rank, but outside of awkwardly bouncing off of those, he's also just a pushover, really. Then we have Baroth, whose tough hide is more just to slow you down than to add difficulty, and most if not all of his attacks have crazy long telegraphs too. Then his buddy companion, Gerardus. He's irritating, sure, but difficult he absolutely is not. I don't really feel the need to explain that. Then we have Titsuyaku. The first time that you see this raptor, he can easily take you by surprise, but once you know that all you have to do to avoid his flash is stand behind his head, he's as easy as any other raptor in the series. Then finally, for our F tier, I've got Paolumu. I think he definitely has some irritants within his fight, lots of wind pressure and movement, but I think for the most part, unless you get caught out in his tail slam combo or something like that from master rank, he shouldn't really cart you, because outside of that, nothing he does is either damaging enough or fast enough to get you before you have a chance to heal. Then let's move on up to the D tier. These are monsters that are absolutely capable of carting you, but if they do, it's nearly always because you made an easily avoidable mistake. And this starts with Great Juros. Quite simply, he has paralysis, which means on a lot of his attacks, if he hits you once, he will hit you twice. Outside of paralysis, he isn't really harder than anything in the F tier, but paralysis itself does earn a slight bump up here. Then we have Pookie. He has some funky animations compared to smaller monsters, and he also has poison, which can get out of hand on its own. After that is Rathian, who again does have poison, but the backflip attack especially can set you up for death extremely quickly. However, with base Rathian, it is such an obscene telegraph on that, it's an undeniable mistake to be hit by that. Following her then is Radabon. His rolling can be a bit hard to track on occasion, like with your camera, but for the most part I consider him pretty easy aside from that. Then we have Levisioth. Like Gerardus, his mechanics are more irritating than difficult. He is not really that weird to fight as a fish monster, though I would say he does get a bit of a bonus just from having more selective attacks, more interactions with splash damage and things like that, but he's not that hard either. After that is Dodogama, and he's honestly here because sometimes I die just because I'm looking too deeply into his derpy little face getting lost in the world, but his moveset can also catch you off on occasion just because you're probably not all that used to it. Next up then is Uragan, for essentially the same reasons as Radabon, just the rolling can be awkward to track and sometimes he will get you from behind. He is also somewhat harder because of the explosive droppings, but I don't think harder enough to warrant a tier hop here. Then we have our first Iceborne monster starting to show up with Beatotus. He's easy to fight, but if you lose patience, he can definitely pull a card out of you here or there. We also have Nightshade Palumu, who for all intents and purposes is just regular Palumu, but with sleep. But sleep definitely does earn it a tier jump here for sure. Then finishing off this tier, we have regular Yangaruga. I just consider him very comparable to Pookie as far as his actual moveset and his shape and mechanical difficulty as well, honestly, even if he does look much gnarlier. Then we have the C tier, and these are monsters that I can easily go a whole hunt without carding to most of the time, but I'm not extremely surprised if they do catch me out on rare occasion. And this starts with Rathalos. Sure, flash pods make him a bit of a joke, at least until his resistance builds up to them, but in terms of actual moveset, he does have some good ways to catch players out. He has both Fire Blight and Poison as well. He flies, which can cause some awkward situations, and his attacks have some pretty big radius on them too, but he is also just an extremely learnable monster, well made in that sense. After him, we have Pink Rathian, who is a clear step up from regular Rathian with even more backflip shenanigans, adding in new backflip animations and shaking up that telegraph, which makes it more dangerous of an attack as it's harder to predict what angle it will come from. Then we have Tobi-Kadachi, and I know people who only remember Endgame will say this is a bit high for him, but gear appropriate Tobi-Kadachi is actually quite tough. He's really quick, he jumps off of the environment, he covers a lot of ground with most of his attacks, but he only really leaves you openings when he gets tired. The damage of each attack he does may not be massive, but it is a pretty relentless onslaught for a lower tier monster. Then we have Kulve Taroth, who only shows up in Iceborne in a non-siege version, so that is what I'm rating here. Her fight is quite cool, and it can be a bit awkward at times, damaging the floor areas around the place and stuff like that, as well as the sheer size of the monster making it quite hard to avoid. I don't think it's much more difficult, however, than Arathalos is in appropriate gear in the time that you're fighting it in the game. After that is Bonbaro, who I think is actually easily able to cart hunters if they just lose track of him for a moment. A good charge and a follow-up from him is all it takes in the start of Iceborne gear, as when you fight him is sort of the difficulty jump where you won't even have master rank armor on yet, really. Then we have Coral Pookie Pookie. Between his split conal beam that he does that catches a lot of players out, and his more interesting and fancy tail attacks and usages of water element, he can absolutely catch people out once in a while. After him then is Barioth, who I think falls under the category of extremely learnable monsters, as he has a ton of solid telegraphs for his attacks that make them very easy to dodge once you understand them, even if when you do get hit by them, they can do a lot of damage. Without knowledge though, he's a tough one, but with knowledge, he is easy even in appropriate gear, and honestly I think the same goes for Frostfang, his variant too, who generally speaking is a bit easier for some weapons but harder for others than the base version, evening out in a pretty similar overall difficulty between them. After him I have Nargacuga. The tail slam that he has can catch you out for sure, but once you know about his moveset properly, and he will just be a very fair fight. After that we have Scarred Jan Garuga, who is essentially just regular Jan but with a couple of new moves, the main one being the sort of multi-fireball attack, which is really cool, but it doesn't really add a crazy amount of extra difficulty at all. And that ends our C tier, so let's move on up to the B tier, which is monsters that I essentially expect to cart once against in a quest if I fight them in appropriate gear, and this one is starting with Diablos. I think he is a really difficult jump in the actual hardness of the fight, and specifically his digging shenanigans add a layer to him where you can't see the actual animation he's doing, and you instead have to rely on your own knowledge of his timings to get it perfectly. He requires a lot of patience to find your openings, and in appropriate gear, having patience means getting closer to the quest timer, which is a type of difficulty in itself. Then we have Legiana. I think she's on a pretty equivalent level to Diablos, honestly. Of course, flash pods will ruin her for a little bit before she builds up resistance, and then you have to deal with Ice Blade as well, which is tough on its own, but she also has a very fast and damaging moveset that covers a large area. After that we have Azure Rathalos. He's basically just Rathalos, but he spends more time in the air, and while that does add a lot of irritation to the fight, it only adds a little bit of difficulty really. Then we have Black Diablos, who I do think is a definite step up from regular Diablos, but not a whole tier's worth of step. I think she is more difficult, but also still within the same general realm for sure. After that is Kieran, and Kieran is just really difficult to actually hit without taking damage. When enraged, most of his body will actually bounce your weapon, and he constantly showers lightning down around himself, and all of that together basically just ruins melee weapons experience with the fight. He is tiny, which makes it really hard to aim for specific parts as well, no matter what type of weapon you're using, to get actual good damage numbers, and he's really quick and agile too, which makes it hard for the larger weapons to get their damage in the first place. He's just an undeniably tough fight to actually get your damage into, but also one that is reasonable enough once you've practiced it and worked out the actual angles and the spacing that you have. Then we have Teostra, who can definitely catch you out with one of his blast powder clouds, or even just blast blade itself, or even just the occasional supernova while you are mid-animation, but for the most part, I consider him to be a very manageable fight once you know him. Outside of that, one master rank attack where he just spews out lava under him, I do not enjoy that. That one is pain. Following him then is Anjanath. His weak spots are a bit hard to hit with most weapons, his attacks have extremely wide reach, and there is nowhere particularly safe to stand near him while dealing proper damage. But once you adjust to learning the telegraphs of his larger moves and finding where the openings are, he does become much more of a standard fight. Fulgur Anjanath I think is pretty much the same difficulty level honestly, just achieving it through different means. Then we have Viper Toby Kadachi, who I think is just a harder fight than regular Toby due to having a similar moveset, sure, but with the addition of both poison and paralysis, as both of those can lead to insta-death combinations extremely quickly, but they also only apply if you manage to get hit by a very telegraphed attack, because most of his attacks have good telegraphs, which makes it feel quite fair. After that is Glavenus. Essentially I have the same reasoning for this as Anjanath. Big monster, tough weak spots to stick to, lots of big AoE attacks, and acidic Glavenus I consider to be very similar to that too, but he also applies defense down to you, which is definitely a slight difficulty increase, but not quite a tier's worth, at least in my mind. After him then is Snamiel, who I think is a monster that always required my full focus to hunt properly. Lots of lower tier monsters, you can sort of just hunt on autopilot, I guess, but I think when you have to start really thinking about your actions is where that difficulty wall breaks, you know? And following that is Shara Ishvalda, the Iceborne final boss. Before endgame gear, that monster has an absolute buttload of health, and it has an extremely wide-reaching and varied moveset as well to learn and to adjust to as well. When you overgear it, you can stunlock it easily, sure, but in appropriate gear, it is actually an appropriate challenge for a final boss. After him then, I have Zinogre, and that is mostly just because he has some combos that are new to his world version that let him catch people out relatively frequently. After that then is Silver Rathalos, who I honestly think is pretty comparable to Azure Rathalos in difficulty when fighting them in appropriate gear. Yes, he does have more vibrant fireballs and a much thicker skull, which does make him a little bit tougher, but I don't think it's quite a tier's worth of difficulty here either. Then finishing off the tier, we have both Odogaron and Ebony Odogaron. They are both extremely fast and agile, which makes them both tough to hit and tough to dodge. They have quite a lot of damage output as well, and they can apply things like bleed that are tough to deal with without outside mechanics like Astera Jerky, for example, and they easily can nab a card off of you per quest if you aren't careful. Then we move on to our A tier, and these are monsters that I consider to be genuinely difficult in the grand scheme of things. Like if I'm going against one of these, I will be sitting up properly in my chair because there's a good chance of quest failure off the back of just a handful of mistakes in a 20-minute plus period of hunting. And this tier starts with Savage Devil Joe. Massive monster, and almost every part of him is a hitbox for a lot of his attacks, which means standing anywhere close to him is a nightmare. He has Tremor, which sucks to deal with, and on top of that, he stays enraged constantly, so you don't really get any breathers or moments to actually properly attack him, or to do things like sharpening your weapon or healing safely. And unlike most monsters, you can't just run to another zone to create some space either, because he will follow you literally forever. After him, we have Kushala Daora. I just think his tornadoes, especially in Master Rank, were extremely obtuse to actually deal with, and his Wind Aura makes it difficult to space yourself for weapon attacks against him, which is difficulty in itself. Then we have Tigrex, who very simply does a lot of damage. He also rarely ever stops attacking, as he has combos that can last like 20 to 30 seconds straight, and he covers a lot of ground with each attack that he does as well. He's just plain dangerous, and the same can be said for Brute Tigrex, who I think is generally easier for melee weapons than regular Tigrex is, but harder for ranged weapons, simply because he actually spends a lot less time charging, but does now have long-range options. Then we have Brachydios. Slime and Blast are an easy concoction for an accidental death that will happen quite frequently, not to mention he just has some surprisingly quick parts of his moveset and does a ton of damage on his own in the first place. After him, I have Shrieking Legiana, which is essentially just Legiana, but with the dial turned up to 11. All of the things that I said about Legiana apply twofold here, and it shows. She's fast, she spent a lot of time in the air, the Ice Blade is a big problem, and it does a lot of damage. Following that, we have Velkhana, who is an extremely learnable monster on most fronts, but some of her elemental attacks have strange interactions with terrain, and her sticky ice scoop that she stabs you in can easily result in a death even on its own if you just get caught in a bad time. Then we have Blackveil Valhazak, who is countered heavily by Nullberries as an item, but even then you can only carry 10 of those at a time, and in appropriate gear he will take a lot more time to kill than 10 Nullberries will last you. So he basically is just a war of attrition, slowly draining your health, removing your maximum health whenever he can, and your healing as well as you use it, trying to counteract this until you just find yourself stuck in an unavoidable sequence of death. After that, I've got Seething Basilgeuse. This one is pretty simple. His general moveset is pretty easy to learn and deal with, but at any given time, a singular stray flower bomb could catch you from behind and one-shot you, and that makes the quest hard all on its own. Following him is Stygian Zinogre for many of the reasons I mentioned with regular Zinogre, except that he has even more dangerous combo attack options than the base version, which often means if you get hit once by him, you will wind up dead more often than not. Then we have Rajang, who is relatively small and tough to hit in his weak spots. He's also extremely quick and mobile, as well as stupidly highly damaging with a lot of attacks built to punish any longer animations at any range. The only saving grace really is free damage whenever you dodge his beam attack. Then we have Furious Rajang, who is generally seen as being much easier for melee players, but much harder for ranged players, but generally an equivalent scale of danger overall. Then we have Safi Jiva, who I think most of the difficulty for comes down to those Sapphire the Emperor hide behind the rock moments, which were much tougher when it required 4 players to kill him, but these days you can solo it, which does make it quite a bit better. Then finally for this tier is Gold Rathian. I think she is the toughest version of any Wrath type monster in Iceborne. She has a ton of different backflip options, which makes it harder to recognize the various telegraphs that she has on an attack that is extremely dangerous, and she also applies venom at this stage, not even just regular poison anymore, and she also gets some of the big fireball shenanigans that Silver Rathalos gets anyways, which also works in part of his difficulty. Moving on to the S tier then, and these are the monsters that I feel genuinely good about being able to kill in a single quest attempt even now years later, with dozens of hours minimum fighting each one, and this starts with Runer Nergigante. He is just big, beefy, fast, the fight changes every time because of the way his spikes grow, but he is also quite learnable. He also gains bleed in Iceborne, which is one hell of a thing to deal with when fighting a Nergigante, and he just has a much faster moveset with a lot of different ways to punish you than his base version. Then we have Raging Brachydios, who I think is also in contention for one of the best quests in all of Monster Hunter history, honestly, with the way that it's done in this game. But it is undeniably quite a tough quest too, and especially when you get to that last scripted section down in the lava area and things start exploding everywhere around you, it makes you really have to stop and just pay attention, or you'll be in big trouble. Then we have Elatrion, who is of course difficult if you ignore his mechanics and don't use elemental weapons at all, but I think his moveset even at a base level is quite difficult, not unmanageable though, but very satisfying to conquer because of its challenge. Then finally we have our S+ tier, and there are only 2 monsters in here, but they are the 2 fights in Iceborne that I dread doing every single time because of just the fear of what will happen, where I am genuinely surprised if I'm able to not cart twice, even on an actually successful hunt. And the first one is Lunastra. Master Rank Lunastra especially is absolutely deadly. Her flame patches on the ground, chaining together, is really tough to deal with. Her supernova is easily capable of catching you off guard and murdering you for even a tiny mistake, or even if you're just stuck in an animation, and even outside of that, her moveset is just quite potent in general, as is her actual damage levels. Finally then today, we of course have Fatalis. His damage is insane, his area coverage on each attack is also insane, and it really is just quite hard to hit him in the head safely, which you have to do before you push him to phase 2, or else you'll have some major problems. Not to mention the fact that there's a 30-minute timer on the quest, which makes it even rougher, and he has a lot of unique mechanics as well that you need to learn that only apply to him. Multiple health percentage based full room wipe mechanics that you need to know how you're supposed to avoid, and countless other things that make him just on another level of difficulty entirely compared to the vast majority of the rest of the monster roster of the game. And that just about does it for today then, everyone. Here's your full tier list of every master rank monster in Iceborne rated by their difficulty, and it took me quite a bit to get this one laid out in a way that I was happy with the arrangement of, but yes, in the end, these are my own opinions that did get us here. So let me know your own thoughts in the comments down below on where you thought I was wrong or right, and what you would do instead. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.